We're turning tonight then to Psalm 36, and it shows us how important it is to maintain the right perspective on this world in which we live. The psalm starts off very bleakly with a description of the wicked, but things take a dramatic shift in verse 5 when God is brought into the equation. Remembering him and looking up to him and thinking upon him makes all the difference to how we view things here on earth. From a human perspective, things can look pretty grim. Verses 1 to 4 here paints a rather dismal picture of the ungodly. There's corruption at the core of his being. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There's an absence of any regard for or concern to please the Creator. There is no fear of God before his eyes. There's self-deception, that his wicked ways are hidden. He flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated, and both his speech and his actions are harmful. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good, and his inward designs and desires and attitudes are thoroughly unwholesome. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. It's an unpleasant picture, and such is the state of the one who completely shuns God and walks in his own way. And as the righteous look on, those who, though not perfect, do love God and care about his honor, as they survey the world around them and observe so much rampant ungodliness and immorality, it can be very unsettling and disturbing. It can alarm us and even utterly dispirit us. And that's why we need to do what David does in the rest of this psalm. He takes a good, long, upward look into heaven and remembers what kind of God it is that reigns there unseen above. And David's thoughts here especially linger on God's loving kindness or steadfast love. 3 times it's referenced in verse 5, verse 7, and verse 10, and it stands in such stark contrast to the wickedness and selfishness of man, this beautiful, committed, dependable love of the Lord's towards his people. Lose sight of that and your heart will fail. But bring it into view and you'll gain the strength and resilience you need to press on in an often harsh and hostile world. So we're going to consider this evening 3 comforts we can take to heart as we look up heavenwards to the Lord who reigns on high. And firstly, verses 5 to 6 point us to the wonderful character of God. 4 magnificent traits are ascribed to the Lord here, and in particular, it's their immeasurable greatness that's highlighted. So first, God's loving kindness is sky high. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, David says, and the word here is one frequently used of God in the Old Testament. It's variously translated as mercy or loving kindness or unfailing love. It speaks of a love that's resolute and loyal and totally committed, a covenant love that sticks by you and stays constant, firm, and true. That's the kind of love God graciously shows to his people, a love that time can't erode and that sin can't extinguish and that changing circumstances can't obliterates. And its scale is astronomical. It extends to the heavens, we're told. So just as the sky goes up and up and up for mile upon mile, and you can't reach the top of it by unaided human efforts. And we might add that just as space beyond keeps going further and further, so that even a rocket sent up there could keep on proceeding for thousands and thousands and thousands of years without ever coming to the edge of space, so God's love is so boundless and colossal. You can't scale its height or find out its limits. It's infinite. Psalm 103 tells us similarly that as far as the heavens are above the earth, so great is the Lord's steadfast love towards those who fear him. And that's the kind of love with which you are loved unceasingly as a child of the Lord. And you can rest assured it's the kind of love, a steadfast love, that won't come to an end. It will always keep on going no matter what. And then God's faithfulness is cloud-reaching. Your faithfulness extends to the clouds, David says. There's this firmness and stability to God, which means he's totally trustworthy and dependable. He's always true to his character, consistent with his promises, and undeviating in fulfilling his words. You know where you are with God. He has this unbreakable fidelity. And this faithfulness, too, is fantastic in its scale. Look up at the clouds and see how far above you and beyond your hand's grasp they are. You can feel so small as you gaze up and see their varied forms floating so inaccessibly high overhead. And God's faithfulness likewise is elevated and lofty and so enormous in its size that you can't really grasp it. And this is the faithfulness by which your life is continually being governed and managed. The faithfulness that lies behind every situation and circumstance God arranges to be brought into your experience. And a faithfulness that will never be put aside, even for a moment, or dispensed with for any reason whatever. And next, God's righteousness is mountain vast. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God, David continues, or it could be rendered great mountains, mighty mountains. The common word for God is related to the concept of might. And think how tiny and puny you feel when staring up at some great peak. Consider the towering loftiness of the Himalayas or the awesome grandeur of the Alps, the sheer massiveness and immensity of those ranges. And God's righteousness is being likened to such mountains in its magnitude and greatness. This is another attribute of God frequently pointed to in Scripture. It refers to his absolute moral integrity, his inflexible justice, his right, fair, even-handed, impartial way of doing things and dealing with people and governing the world. And it's this righteousness that oversees and superintends your life and indeed all that unfolds down here on earth. So yes, the wicked may well prosper for a season, but sooner or later God straightens things out again, and he won't let injustice go undealt with indefinitely. And then God's judgments are ocean deep. Your judgments are like the great deep, David says. Righteousness and judgment are frequently paired together in the Old Testament, and there is some degree of overlap in their meaning. And it's important to note this word judgment doesn't always carry the negative sense of condemning and punishing sin. It can refer more generally to all the sovereign administrations and decisions of God as they unfold in history. So he acts in favorable judgments towards those he deems to be righteous, and he vindicates them. And then he does also show his displeasure against those whom he finds to be guilty and gives them eventually their just deserts. And his judgments are compared to the great deep, that is the colossal hugeness of seas and oceans. So think of the Atlantic with its mile after mile of seemingly endless blue, or the Pacific with its incredible depth, just going down and down and down and down. And that's how we should think of God's judgments. There's a weightiness and a gravity and a profundity to them that's beyond human grasp. Paul exclaims in the New Testament in Romans 11, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. There's an unfathomability about them. But for believers, those judgments are a comfort. They are ultimately advantageous to us and not to be dreaded. They're the outworkings of God's wisdom and goodness that mean however things seem at the moment, all will be well in the end. This is what the unseen God of heaven is like, infinite and immeasurable in his loving kindness, his faithfulness, his righteousness, and his judgments. And that's what we have to continually remember and hold on to. And we know that these traits have been put on display even more wonderfully now in and through God's Son, Jesus Christ. We can look especially at the cross and we see God's love demonstrated in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We can see God's faithfulness shown there as he fulfills all those ancient promises and pledges to redeem his people. We behold his righteousness, as Paul reminds us in Romans 3, because the sins that were formerly passed over by God are then properly dealt with that sacrifice of Christ. And we see God's judgment set forth as his wrath against wickedness is poured out on Christ, and that happens so that he might be just and the justifier of those who have faith in Jesus. Justification is a judgment of a positive kind. It's God's judgment on your life that you're not guilty on account of Christ's sacrifice. The beautiful, wonderful character of God. And then moving on to verses 7 to 9, we're pointed to the bountiful care of God. These great characteristics of the Lord are not just abstract ideas that have no practical bearing on our daily lives here on earth. No, they're worked out in the experiences of God's people. His loving kindness, for example, is something believers find to be a priceless treasure to them, something sweet and delightful to their experience. So David cries out, "How precious is your steadfast love, O God." It's something he's come to value so highly because it makes such a difference to his life. Verse 6 already hinted at this. In his love and righteousness, what does God do? He saves or preserves man and beast. That is the ongoing sustaining and preserving and upholding of all life, human and animal, is testimony to the superlative goodness of God, his kindness and his grace. The fact that you are simply alive and breathing today is an outworking of God's mercy. And now in these next verses, David spells out 3 other ways in which this loving kindness of God is manifested in particular benefits received by his people. So he provides protection. Verse 7, the children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. It's a lovely expression, isn't it? We think of the birds, perhaps a great, strong eagle covering its little vulnerable chicks with its large, powerful wings to shelter them from all harm and danger. They feel so safe and snug and secure under that feathery canopy. And that's what God is like towards the children of mankind. We can find protection and comfort under his vigilant care and defense of us. And he provides abundance. They feast on the abundance of your house, David continues, and you give them to drink from the river of your delights. And again, that's a beautiful picture, isn't it? Here is God's great banqueting house with these massive tables laden, weighed down with the very finest of fare, literally with fatness, a massive overflowing bounty of mouth-watering food, more than enough to satisfy. And here for them also to draw from is this river of pleasures, and the word used there is related to the words for Eden. These are the waters of paradise flowing by, and from them God's children can take their fill and quench their deepest longings and thirsts. God supplies for our souls the joy and delights of knowing him and his blessings. And that's what gives us true inward satisfaction. And he provides life and light with you as the fountain of life, David continues. And in your light do we see light. Light and life are often linked together in the Bible, and they both alike flow from God. He's the source and spring of all life, physical, spiritual, and eternal. We cannot have any kind of life apart from him. And he's the God who is light himself and whose light enlightens us. God shines into our minds and he gives us a knowledge of himself, an understanding of the truth. So we're utterly dependent on him for these two great basic essentials that we can't afford to be without. Life and light. We need both in the physical realm, but so much more we need spiritual life and spiritual light. That is knowledge and understanding of the truth, especially about God himself. So these are the things that the unseen God of heaven bestows on his children, and this likewise is what we must be remembering and rejoicing in, that though the ungodly may often seem to be better off than us and having an easier time than us and more successful in the world than us, yet in reality we're the blessed ones because we're blessed in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, tasted to a degree now and in fullness in the age to come. And thirdly, verses 10 to 12 point us to the powerful conquest of God. The psalm began with the ungodly thinking and plotting and acting wickedly and believing he'll get away with it, but it ends with the ungodly man fallen, cast down and unable to arise. And it's all come about by the sovereign intervention of this unseen God. There's a cry to the Lord in verse 10. Surrounded by the wicked, David recognizes his need of God's steadfast love and righteousness to keep on being shown. And so he calls out, "Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart." He can't get by without it. In the apparent hopelessness of his human situation, and there are many times like that in the narrative of David's life, he can't see any way forwards without the Almighty stepping in and acting. So he wants this loving kindness and justice of God to keep on being displayed, to keep on being demonstrated in new and fresh, wonderful ways. He's so utterly dependent upon them. And that's to be our attitude as well, to see God's gracious action and faithful ways as absolutely essential to our well-being. And so we keep crying to him, "Show more mercy, pour out more grace, show your goodness and righteousness still further." If we're believers, we've already received and enjoyed much of his mercy and grace, but we're to keep on, like little chicks that keep on asking for more from their parents. We're to keep on pleading with the Lord to keep on his downpour of grace and mercy coming. And in what particular way does David want God's mercy to be shown? "Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away." In other words, don't let the proud and the ungodly overcome me and get the better of me. Prevent it, O Lord. And we have a God who's able to do just that. However powerful and unstoppable and arrogantly swaggering an enemy may seem, be it a spiritual enemy, chiefly the devil, or those whom he uses in this world to oppose and fight against God's kingdom, the Lord is well able to thwart them and frustrate them and scupper their plans. And that's what we see at the very close of the psalm. The workers of iniquity are conquered and defeated. They can never triumph in the long run, because God always sees to it that they are brought down eventually. Maybe a long time in coming, but it's the predictable conclusion to every rebellion against the Lord. And this great conquering power is seen chiefly and most spectacularly in and through Christ. So at the cross, he routs the armies of the evil one and bruises Satan's head, as promised centuries before. And at his resurrection, he destroys the power of death and shows complete mastery over the grave. And at his return, all the hosts of wickedness will lie trampled and helpless under his feet, completely incapacitated and unable to do any damage ever again. So however things may seem at the moment, even if at times evil seems like it's on the increase, remember, actually, from a heavenly perspective, evil is on its way out, its days are numbered, and it's God and his righteousness that will prevail in the end. So it's absolutely critical that we just don't know these things as theory in our head, but we're maintaining this right perspective as we look out on the world in which we live. Yes, we do live in a world full of evil, but always remember to factor the magnificent, gracious, faithful, righteous, judging God into the equation. Seeing him makes all the difference. David, you can imagine, would have been totally crushed and dejected if he'd only looked upon the wicked gnashing their teeth at him and seemingly stronger than he. But he set the Lord always before him, and that's how he found strength and courage to keep on going, in the awareness of him. And we likewise have to stay consciously mindful of what's true about our God, our sovereign protector, unseen, yet forever at hand. We don't need to be despondent and terror-struck, whatever may be happening in the news. We don't need to faint and lose heart. Remember, though you cannot see him, God's character and God's care and God's assured conquest over evil, and let that keep on revolutionizing the way you see and interpret the world. His loving kindness extends to the heavens and his faithfulness to the clouds. Amen.